Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Red Hat. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning, where we have an exciting PulseMeter webinar report ahead. But before we dive into things, I do have just a couple of notes I'd like to review with everyone. First of all, we are recording today's session. So if you miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to rewatch later, or of course, if you'd like to share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access this recording on demand. And you'll receive that email shortly after we conclude, as soon as this video is available for on demand. Now, this is going to be very dialogue heavy today. Everything on our slides is mostly graph based. So we want you to be part of our conversation. There are a couple of ways you can join with us. The first option is to use the chat tab on the right side of your screen. So when you find that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you are joining us from today. Now, if you have specific questions, we want to be able to keep track of them and answer them as we come in. So we ask that you send your questions to the Q&A tab on the right side of that chat section. Additionally, if you jump over to the handout section, you'll see there are a copy of the slides, a copy of the PulseMeter report, as well as a couple additional resources there for you. So feel free to check those out at any time throughout our program. And we will also be selecting two winners who are the most engaged with our program today. And those two winners will be receiving $50 Amazon gift cards after we close out. So to dive right into our topic, we'll be discussing CI/CD security anti-patterns and antidotes. And joining me today is Michelle DePalma, Principal Product Manager at Red Hat, Mike Foster, StackRock's Community Lead at StackRox, and leading us through our conversation today is Mitchell Ashley, CTO here at Techstrong Group and GM of Techstrong Research. And Techstrong Research conducted the surveys that brought us to the analytics we have in our report today. So Michelle and Mike, thank you both so much for joining us on Techstrong Learning. Mitch, do you want to dive us right into some numbers?
You bet. Thank you very much, Cody, for that introduction. Let me first say I'm going to have Mike and Michelle introduce themselves in just a moment. But to give everybody some context, there's a lot of discussion about software supply chain security and how do we secure the pipeline and how do we secure the things that go into the pipeline at any stage in the process. So a lot of people are doing some really good work, including Red Hat, around how to better secure that. And so we're here to kind of learn from each other. We're doing that using something called the PulseMeter. We actually put poll questions on Techstrong's websites. If you don't know, Techstrong does DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Cloud Native Now, Techstrong TV, etc. They have Techstrong.ai. So we asked our audience, and we have a very large population of readers who come to those sites or watch videos. And we asked them a series of questions, and then we review those and discuss them and create a report from that. Now, this is an analyst report that's sponsored by Red Hat, which means we collaboratively worked on what we think those questions are. And I think they'll provide some great insights. So I'm going to be putting up slides because I'm a no slide zone person. These are charts that we just really want to present and then discuss together. To Cody's point, this can be highly interactive. Matter of fact, I would love for you to comment in chat. I don't agree with this. I like this. Hey, what about this? Here's a reaction or a thought or comment. Feel free, because we'll engage with you there, as well as incorporate that into our discussion today. You can also ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab or just type something into chat. We'll do our best to follow it, but we're going to do that as we go. There's not a Q&A at the end. So that way you get to be a part of the whole conversation and help shape where we go. So before I start putting numbers up in front of everybody, Michelle, would you just say a little bit about yourself? Please introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Michelle DePalma, product manager at Red Hat, deeply in the secure supply chain space. So trusted software, secure supply chain, as we put it all together. And I just wanted to say to anyone in the audience who may have participated in one of these polls or surveys on Techstrong, thank you, because as a product manager, we kind of live for these things. Like I can only go and talk to my customers so often before they've had enough of me. So the surveys are actually really important, and they absolutely help us make decisions about the product. So if anyone's participated, thank you for that. Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, thanks,
Right.
Michelle. I'm Mike Foster. I'm the community lead for StackRox, also principal in technical marketing here at Red Hat. I've been in container and Kubernetes security specifically for over 6 years now with the original StackRox product that Red Hat bought in 2021. And like Michelle said, because we're so ingrained in the open source community, it's awesome hearing feedback from the users and not through the various, let's say, corporate channels. So thanks for joining.
Fantastic. Appreciate you both. And as Cody said, I'm CTO at Techstrong, and I also head up our analyst business, the work that we're doing today. So let's jump into this. We really wanted to look at how are people thinking about supply chain, or excuse me, more specifically, CI/CD pipeline security. And the title talks about antidotes, and antidotes are anti-patterns. And anti-patterns are things that they're patterns, but they may not be doing everything you expect them to do. Might even lead you to a false sense of security. So we'll see some things that might be that, as well as things that are good security practices. So I'm going to bump back up and we'll hit our first slide here. One of the first questions we asked is just the priority around securing your CI/CD pipeline. And it's kind of guessing, not too surprising, right? 51% said very important. Another 19% said it's important. So we're getting 70 when you get basic. So most people see this as a priority. So I'm guessing, Mike and Michelle, that this is probably not a big surprise to any of us, but it is a confirmation, especially as you talk to customers and people in the community. So feel free to comment on this.
I was going to ask you, I think we briefly spoke about it before, but what was the audience breakdown? How did the poll takers self-identify? DevSecOps, DevOps, developers?
I'll pull that up. I have that data separately. I don't have
Okay.
a chart for that, but let me look that up while we're chatting, and I'll bring it up later.
Okay. I was just wondering if it would be higher, actually. Like if you're in that ops, if you're heavy DevOps, even without the little sec in there, like it's table stakes, right? Top of mind all the time, reactionary kind of stuff. So just curious.
Yeah, I'd almost break down this chart into enterprise/regulated industries, startups, who are just getting off the ground, maybe not a priority. It's more pushing functionality, or just the average developer that's working on their own. And then you can kind of see maybe emerging tech / somebody that's breaking into a larger organization. It almost seems like it's broken down by that strata of developer / DevOps people, right? And I do want to point out that available standards and following guidelines doesn't necessarily mean security. It also just means you're implementing checklists to help you be secure, but we're trusting those standards, right?
It's a good point. There is following the framework and kind of doing your best job of implementing what might be best practices or considered kind of quasi standards, if you will. And then there's kind of, we do this, and then if we have a problem, we go add more to it. And as you go, and to your point, Mike, the kind of organization you are makes a big difference of how much you have to invest, how soon, how big it is to implement something like that. If you're doing this, thinking about CI/CD pipeline security across 25 different teams that are doing projects, that's a big effort, right? To implement that. Not that you don't, but that takes time, especially if they're not all using the same tools and integration points, or at the same level of maturity in their own development, kind of doing DevOps and using a pipeline. So, your mileage varies a lot. You can, depending on if you're a greenfield, like we were talking about earlier. So,
yeah, and if anyone in the chat is implementing a salsa framework, I would love to hear from you, because that's a pretty broad but also extremely strict framework if you're getting up to level 4. So if anybody's at level 3, level 4, I'd love to hear what that process has been like.
Great. And somebody noted we have a problem with the link, I think, in the handout section. So I think we're getting that addressed here. So let's talk about it, the next question that we asked. And by the way, the whole report for this, we're just looking at some of the data from the report today. The whole report, everyone who attends and registers will get that report in an email, but you can also download it in the handouts section. So at risk of you asking questions we're going to talk about later, go ahead and download it now if you want to take a look at it, or just sit back and join us in this part of the conversation. So thinking about the stages of the CI/CD pipeline, what do you believe is most vulnerable? Interesting. Source code and image repositories, in other words, input into the front of it, right? Now, this could be public, it could be our own also, right? But I think there's a lot more attention around vulnerabilities and compromises getting into, um, build standards of images and package managers, things like that. Build, code, and test. So we're at 19%, about equally there, and then less so around deploy and runtime. So curious about your reactions to this.
Question. So source and image repositories is all the external stuff that you're pulling in, right? All the open source stuff. And then code, I assume they meant their in-house code. So there's always that assumption that your in-house stuff is great, right? Or, I mean, only worried about it a little bit, right? That I see that a lot without recognizing just how much of your in-house stuff is really dependent on open source and so on. So that I'm not surprised, although I wonder if if you were to look at the breakdown in their code about how much is pulled in externally and how much they've built, if it actually reflects, like, you know what I mean? Like 75% is actually pulled in from outside, 25% is in-house. Clearly this worry about it doesn't reflect the actual breakdown of where they're getting their library. So that's interesting to me. So sorry, that was what caught my eye right away.
Mm-hmm.
So.
For sure. I definitely think that there's security teams are worried about source and image repositories, and developers are worried about it, whereas developers might not be as worried at runtime about how their application is performing. That's more a security/ops perspective. From an impact standpoint, it's the largest, import or bringing in secure code that you can then build a program around. If you ever have to change packages or do any backporting of fixes, that takes an extreme amount of time. So it's probably one of the bigger impacts. Right. So making sure that that is secure from the start seems to be, I'm surprised it says most vulnerable, because there's a ton of tools and strategies to help you limit this, especially at large enterprises. So kind of curious. I feel like it's the biggest impact to change, but I'm shocked that it's the most vulnerable point for a lot of people.
Yeah, one of the reactions I hadn't seen this is this pointing the finger at somebody else? Not me. It's the other people's code, right? Natural human tendency I've done that myself about things. Or is this just more focus and attention on, we haven't really worried about the package manager. We just think it's, when it updates, right? It's giving us good stuff. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's introducing. So there's a lot more attention on that, I think, right now. And maybe that's why it's listed as the number one. It's hard to tell because we didn't say, and why do you say this? So we don't have exactly the thinking behind it. But it is interesting that that's got everyone's attention from this.
Well, we experience at Red Hat all the time because we're so ingrained in these communities that part of the platform is saying, hey, because we publish all these fixes and we're ingrained in the open source communities, you can trust the code that we ship because we verify and do all our fixes before we give it to our enterprise customers. Now, if you're an enterprise that doesn't use someone like Red Hat, you have to do that verification and testing as part of the onboarding process for open source code. So somebody's doing the verification, whether it's your company or some company like Red Hat. And there's a lot more tools now coming up in the ecosystem to help you look at trustability in open source code, whether it's the authors, how many different companies are in it, so that you don't end up with like a heartbleed where there's two GitHub authors taking care of this large open source package that a lot of enterprises are using.
Since I have my product hat on these days, I was just going to add that something like this helps me make a decision about what tools I want to see if I'm going to productize or something like that. So if I look at this, I'm like, wow, source and image repositories, that's really dragging left. Do I have something to answer that from the get-go as opposed to some of the other ones that happen later on? Like, where am I in the pipeline? And can I enable someone to get the answers they need at that time? So if it's top of mind for the developers, then I need to make sure that my product speaks to that. So I just want to, that's how we kind of, juggle priorities in terms of products. So this one clearly says, give me something early on. I think it says the source and image repositories at the very beginning when I'm making those decisions, please give me some information to help me make a good decision, as opposed to runtime. I would use a different tool, and this audience seems to be less concerned about that, about what's running in my cluster or something. So just That's the product.
Yeah, with some great questions and comments. Please, folks, everybody, keep those coming in, and just kind of for our panel, just a little bit of a heads up. Some of the questions, if we can weave into our conversation, or what are some of the steps for securing CI/CD pipelines? We have some data on that, and we'll make some of our own suggestions and recommendations. And of course, how do we avoid vulnerabilities in CI/CD? I assume they mean the CI/CD pipeline, and this is point out one, right? I mean, any of those stages potentially can introduce vulnerabilities. And there are scanners for source images, there's code scanning, there is a lot of other techniques to protect not just code, but also pipeline poisoning, injecting something into the process, like we've seen with some compromises along the way. So,
yeah, Matteo in the chat made a good point that runtime's underestimated. I think security teams don't underestimate it. It really just depends on your org structure. A lot of times developers hand off their code to a operations or a platform engineering team, and then they give them feedback, and developers really want to understand performance and crashes and things like that, but they're not necessarily worried about the platform and how it's networked or set up, or if there's exposed secrets. And so it tends to fade into the background. But it's a good point just about how organizations are structured and if they talk to each other. And developers should care, though. Completely agree with Mateo.
Good point. Then thanks, Mateo, Jason, Daniel, everybody who's been commenting too. I have this axiom I've developed over the years. You know who developed the slide or the chart? Whoever's at the center of it, that's the function. Security, networking, development. So, and here, we have a very broad audience across our websites in DevOps and security and cloud native. So here, I think we got a pretty good cross section from our source data, the people that completed these polls. So let's look at the next one. What attack surfaces are you concerned about for your CI/CD? Vulnerabilities in open source. That's a big topic, right? People are talking about that a lot. Exposure of secrets. I'm glad to see that's high because what are the frequent sins we keep committing around secrets in code and in repositories. Insecure tools from developers, insecure system configs, use of third-party services, poison pipeline execution, insufficient pipeline controls. I mean, and there are others, but these are the ones that kind of came out on top. Mike, do you want to comment first on this one?
Sure. I mean, the vulnerabilities, I think, just lends more credibility to what we were talking about before in open source components, cutting down on those, especially early on. Exposure of secrets, this as part of the build pipeline. I'm not sure if people have seen some of the issues with GitHub Actions, for example, where you're bringing in a GitHub action and then it relates to a bunch of other, let's say, insecure code that can then poison the pipeline. So there's knowing when to inject secrets, at what time, being able to rotate them, and having the, let's say, alerting in place. Unit 42 from Palo Alto Prisma Cloud recently just created a honeypot where they shipped a bunch of secrets and they wanted to see how quickly all the bots would pick up on it. And somebody had pulled the secrets and attacked their honeypot cloud service within 5 minutes. So it was like one IAM role that got exposed in a repo, and within 5 minutes, somebody was going across their honeypot cloud clusters. So the same bots that are telling you on GitHub or GitLab that you exposed a secret, there's the other bots that are farming them to use them extremely quickly. So that exposure is, let's say, high impact and very important.
I was going to say, I'm a little bit surprised that this is not more skewed. So given the previous slides, I would have thought, oh, everyone's going to blame vulnerabilities in open source. That's what's going to happen. But that's not actually, this is very thoughtful, right? Like you said about secure exposure of secrets and so on. Like I'm a little bit surprised. This is good. It means that the people taking this are aware of all the kinds of problems that can happen along the way, right? They're not throwing open source under the bus. They're actually saying, hey, these are the other problems that we have. So I like that, but it does surprise me in terms of how people behave. So that's all. That's what I noticed about this slide in particular. So.
Vincent Dannon, the head of product security at Red Hat, he had a talk about, do all vulnerabilities really matter? And at ACS and StackRox, we're trying to import known exploit data along with the scoring, along with the risk factors, because not every vulnerability is made the same. Some of them don't necessarily affect your product, and you need to weigh all of that when you're importing code. And so if you look at the vulnerabilities, especially the ones that are known to be exploited, it's a very small percentage of the total amount of vulnerabilities that are out there in the open source and cloud community, right? So while you might use a scanner and it shows 1,000 vulnerabilities in a cluster or a platform, that might mean that only 3 are known to be exploited, and they can be, let's say, mitigated by simple adjustments. So I'm hoping that that's one of the reasons why it kind of ticked down, is because people have implemented the proper scanning and protocols to mitigate this. That's my.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, outside of the big, vulnerabilities that everyone hears about and reacts to, after that, I would say I have heard from customers about exposure of secrets, even if it's internal, right? Like it doesn't necessarily have to be something external, but internally, oh, those credentials were placed where they shouldn't be, or someone in DevOps had access to something that they shouldn't have. That I is pretty common. So I'm not surprised about what's number 1 and number 2, but I think also things like insufficient pipeline access control, all of them, I wonder how many of them know. Like if you're not in the know about this pipeline, I've certainly worked at organizations where they did not spill the beans internally. Like that's not true of Red Hat. Like we're actually really open internally as well. But I've worked in financial institutions where if something was misconfigured, we would not share that with the larger development team. So I'm happy to see that this is actually reasonably spread out instead of just the top one. So.
Yeah, Jason says they're all equally important, to be honest. I agree.
They are.
Yeah.
Well, and that's actually reflected in the data. There's only 6% swing between the top and the bottom of this list. So it isn't like we've had 40% said one and 2% said something else. They're all clustered together. So in sort of countering that first question where we said, oh, it's external third-party sources and we're blaming that stuff, that comment I made, I think this disputes that and says, no, we're looking at it holistically, which is good. I'm glad that that's the answer. I wanted to point out to folks, and we have another person that's on our team from Red Hat, Colin Chu, who is answering questions that are in the Q&A tab and publishing those answers and sharing them with everybody. So feel free to check out some of those questions, because there's things like what are some of the steps for securing CI/CD pipelines? Some things we're going to be talking about again later as well. So feel free to check that out as well as. And we do appreciate more great comments in chat. Maybe this is reflective of how the question was asked. It's something we always are very concerned about, and in data analytics and as analysts, of course. So. Great. Anything else, or should we jump to our next one? Okay, let's go. Have you experienced, interesting question. Now this is anonymous, so people could answer with no threat of repercussions. Have you experienced a security incident in your CI/CD pipeline in the last 12 months? So 21% yes, 19% don't know, and 60% essentially said no. So interesting. I'm not surprised that I would think more people would say no or don't know. I was surprised at 21%. And that could be any kind of a security incident. Like we got unsecured code coming into the front end. We had a tool compromised. So there's a large list of things that this potentially could be. Maybe you weren't surprised by the 21%. I'm curious your thoughts.
Mike, do you want to go?
I was more surprised by the 60% no. Is everybody implemented trusted software supply chain? They know everything's signed. They know everybody that has access. All the Git checkouts and check-ins and PRs and all that stuff are all signed by people that are verified. No, I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy that people are very confident in their CI process. But just, I hope there's some sort of alerting that if anything goes wrong. I think don't know. I expected don't know to be bigger. A lot of developers check in, they go through the tests, but then maybe at the last stage of deployment, another image, there's access issues and they're not alerted to that. I feel like it's no, but then in brackets within my realm of what I'm seeing as part of that pipeline process. So
I agree with that, like within my realm, because if it's not something for you to action on, like you're just submitting to the pipeline, then, and something was misconfigured, why would you may not necessarily know, depending on the culture of the organization. So yeah, I thought don't know would be pretty big. I would flip don't know and know. So that's interesting.
There's sort of the what's the saying, unknown unknowns, right? Maybe you don't
Yeah.
know. And so there could be an overconfidence. It could be people are taking this very seriously. And, I think increasingly what we all are. There was a great comment here by Daniel. He said, insecure tools from developers is indeed a very serious risk. And he was talking about, he had some developers add tools to container images for debugging purposes. And that's part of that. Things can be introduced at many stages along the pipeline. You could have someone introduce a tool for performance testing, in a test or even production environment. That potentially could lead to a vulnerability, a security risk. So I think that tools question was really important as an option that we put in this poll question, because it's not something we always think about is kind of the tool side, libraries and packages and all of that, of course. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown. And sorry, Michelle, with StackRox or ACS, a lot of the recommendations that we have is at prod, all those are getting removed as part of the build process. So developers can have those tools, put it into test, secluded environment. And then when you're pushing to prod, you're rebuilding the images, but you're pulling those tools out, and we can see all of that. That seems to be the halfway that I've seen with security and developers as part of StackRox. I'm curious, Michelle, if you've experienced anything like that.
Oh, sorry. I was reading chat.
I know there's some good stuff in there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Could you say that again? My apologies.
Just the trade-off between a security tool and how do you give developers the tools they need to test their product or application, but then secure at runtime. So, if you have those security gates where it's informed during test and staging, but then enforced during prod, where you can't have a get or an NC or a curl or anything like that in production at runtime.
So the organizations that I've worked at that had that working had streamlined processes. It was because anytime you put a speed bump in someone's way, they go around it, right? You need to test something, you need an answer. So it's interesting, like you have your suite of tools that it's all good, but if you're not giving people what they need at the point that they need it, they go around you. So if you're going to develop a golden path, for instance, like you can't make it the most difficult path that they choose. It has to actually be a great path. So that is what I've seen, where like teams got together, platform engineers, DevOps and so on, actually sat with their teams and said, okay, we can force you, but that's not what we want to do, and that's not productive. So let's agree that we're going to do this kind of pipeline with that kind of package manager. This is what our CI/CD looks like. We're only doing delivery, continuous delivery. We're going to push off continuous integration and something else, things like that. And then you can talk about these tools. But anytime they come down and just tell you, someone's working around you. I guarantee it. So I was going to ask, within the 21%, do we think that if we were to break it out to the different types of problems and incidents they had, would it match the previous slide? Do you think that they answered vulnerability is number one, number two was secrets? Right? Is this really sort of giving us a window into what that 21% was? Just curious, or someone in the chat thinking that. So.
A question for which we do not have data to answer. It's a great question.
Yeah, I know I think we have a question about effect later on. How did it affect your business? So I would think they might line up with some of the later questions. But yes, I mean, I've seen a lot of just the insecure access, not shutting down repositories at the beginning and then adding access as needed. Secrets exposure is definitely going to be a big one, especially for people who may be new to Git or let's say uploading credentials at the wrong time. But it's always the impact. They've had a security incident, but was it security coming in and saying, hey, why does this person have access in our company to another repo and then having to shift things? Or was this an external hack, right? Not all of us work on the most public applications and are high target priorities for hackers. That doesn't mean that if you go and publish a secret that they're not going to find it, right? So there's a little bit of, let's say, incentive when you look at your application for hackers. Is it a high incentive hack? Is it low? You need to look at your applications and adjust accordingly.
I think
someone in the chat. Oh, sorry, it was just about controlled. I see some control.
This is about introducing tools by developers.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, if folks want to jump in, someone up the line here, I'm not sure how to say his name, should developers introducing tools be controlled or free to do that? So vote in chat. Just jump in. We'd love to hear from you. And Mateo, you were extremely bright because you agreed with me. 20%, 21% is a very high percentage from my perspective. So he must be a super smart individual since he agreed with me. Anyway, some great stuff. Oh, here we go. Look what Cody did. Should tools be freely introduced or controlled?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So let's say the yes equals freely introduced and no is controlled.
Yeah, I
So
think it goes hand in hand with the maturity level of the organization. I think that's spot on. Larger organizations and enterprises are going to maintain all those packages internally and say, a developer, you have access to this suite of tools. When you're building a startup, they're a lot more lax.
mhm. Great. We've got some good votes coming in. I'm going to let it run a few more minutes. Let's do this. Vote if you haven't voted. I want to jump to our next chart, our next data point. What steps are you taking to harden your CI/CD pipeline? Someone asked in the Q&A, what are the steps to take? This isn't necessarily the linear set of steps or all of them, but for sure, some very important ones. So, and again, we don't have a huge spread between the top and the bottom response, 12 to 8%, 4% differentiation, which says, and people could select more than one of these options. So it wasn't a pure ranking. But isolated build environment, you see much more emphasis being put around that, but also, of course, doing things to isolate CI/CD. We have secrets again, securing your tools, base images, some things again. Code signing comes up here. Artifact repository for builds, security related test cases, policies enforced as code. Security as code. Static application security testing type tools. So we have a real mix of things that I think many people are doing or beginning to add to their existing security practices. Michelle, comments on this?
I have wishes. I'm like, oh, I'd like to see code signing a little higher. Those are just, I'm sorry, I have my product hat on. I have my thing that I
think
want
we
to see
will,
bumped up a
but
little bit.
yes.
Yeah, I'd like to see that a little higher. Create secure base images. I assume that also included using someone else's base secure images, stuff like that. Let me think about it a little more. This is interesting.
Okay.
Like I have to see
A lot of data
how
here.
to interpret it. Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
Mike, I'm sure you don't have any opinions about this.
No, it is good to see the range, and that it's, the difference between 8 to 12 means a lot of people are at least considering it, and just maybe some things they don't necessarily need. Secure isolated build environment. I'm not shocked that's the highest because it kind of remedies a lot of the other issues we see. If you're using like GitLab on-prem in a private network, not exposed, you can get away with a lot of more insecure configurations between your developers because it's just an internal tool. It's off a network, not exposed. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's secure or that it's properly configured, obviously. But, having something that's on-prem in a secure environment does insulate you from, let's say, having to implement something like zero trust in GitHub that's public repo, and making sure that all your branches are protected and all this stuff. You can get away with a little bit more internally.
One of my observations about this, if you look at the first top 4 on the left, if you add to that, artifact repository is developers, and let's talk about, people, not just developers, DevOps engineers, testers, et cetera, but especially developers are the new attack surface, right? You think about these are ways that vulnerabilities or attacks get introduced through the people who are writing the code. And sometimes that's also social engineering here. Hey, put this post on whatever, stack this or Reddit that, and all of a sudden I'm testing something with some weird link, and who knows what I got into the code supply here, into the supply chain. So it's good to see the things that developers specifically are using and doing, as well as platform engineers, people developing the images, the environments, because we are an attack surface. It's on everybody's radar and growing. So
Can I ask you a question? Sorry, about the secure your CI/CD tools. Is that a configuration issue? Does that mean like who has access to the CI/CD tooling, or I was trying to figure, like, it's because it's short. I'm like, okay, what was
when we designed this, Michelle, the intent was that encompasses both access controls of who does it, who manages it, et cetera, and then are there any other attack vectors that you could have pipeline poisoning? So let's say something coming through the pipeline could then compromise that isn't the person that using access control. So kind of multiple vectors that encompass that. Now people interpreted it whatever they think that means. That was our intent.
Yeah, and this highlights Daniel's point with code signing and, more important, verification, because a lot of exploited code was signed when they hijacked the pipeline. They also get the signing credentials, which is 100% true, right? If your pipeline isn't secure on the left, it doesn't mean because it's signed and enforced at runtime that it's going to be useful at all, right? There's a lot of, I don't want to say security theater, but SBOMs, for example, great tool. Just because you know what's getting run in your code, you don't know who created the SBOM, you don't know who's verifying it, you don't know how it's actually going to play in. So it's a data point to help you secure, just like having a certain amount of people that are accessing your pipelines and signing it with their verification, so you know exactly who uploaded the code. It's a data point. If certain things change, you can enforce on it, but it's just to give you an overall picture of risk, right? It doesn't mean that there's a one size fits all or one tool to solve all of your needs.
Right. Someone asked in Q&A, what's a good, what do you recommend for digitally signing code? I assume SigStore. It's the other open source that Colin mentioned, cosign, I think it's Rico or Recker. I can't remember how you say it. For immutable ledger. Any other, and you've said this, you wish it was higher, Michelle. Any other thoughts, recommendations on code signing?
No, you those are the words that would have come out of my mouth. SigStore and CodeSign. I'm just looking at if there's anything else in here that surprises me about every protective vulnerability management is every enterprise has it. Like, so I guess is it a forgotten child here, or is it because it's actually there? I just wonder if maybe it's table stakes, so it's not mentioned or quite as high in people's minds. So just wondering about that, because I feel like recently I certainly heard, like, the last 2 years it's been like salsa this and SBOM that. So, but the actual vulnerability management stuff, we are talking about it as a topic, but in terms of the maturity of the product space, pretty high actually, and enterprises already having it in place, yes, that is also there too. So I'm wondering if it only got 8% because it's like, do you have bathrooms at the office? Well, of course we have bathrooms at the office, and we also have a vulnerability management system. So I'm just wondering if that's why it scored lower. So just a little data analysis going on in my mind. So.
I think you have a good point, because when people fill out surveys, and it's a point in time, right? It's what their focus is right now. And I think if you ask this, 3 years ago, we wouldn't worry as much about, source code or repositories or package managers or other things, maybe, static analysis or ISDAST are kind of new things and getting introduced. So it's all relative to where we are and where people filling it all are at. So I think you're spot on, Michelle. Great. Let's see. Let's take another look here. In the last 12 months, have you experienced any of the consequences of a CI/CD security issue or incident listed above? Now, security issue doesn't mean you got attacked and they got in and they stole stuff and now your code's being published on, somewhere on GitHub or some other place. Just that there's been, you found a faltering in your security. You've found an area in your policies that were deficient, so you've gone in and beefed that up. So the things that we listed below, what were some of the impacts that you experienced? Now, at the bottom, of course, there's 34% said we haven't had any, so no issue. But others said slowed and delayed application development, data loss, application downtime, employee termination, 11%. I'm kind of surprised at that. Customer revenue loss, 10%. fines 5%. That's interesting from a regulatory perspective. What do you all think of this data?
Well, congrats on the 34%, the thankless job of security. Everything's working as expected. Hopefully that's what's going on. I don't want to bite my tongue. I think the slow delayed app development and the downtime aspect are really, they're the hidden cost of security, of buying a security product. One of the challenges about selling security, for example, is that all costs money to the business, but there's no way to measure that for a specific customer or for an organization, right? And things like secure base images and having that signing and doing it all from the start makes it so that when we do focus on a vulnerability, we know exactly what's wrong with it and if it should be patched or not, which obviously could delay an app, but it's good to focus on those core use cases because we don't have to be chasing our tails and constantly trying to keep up with all of the other issues. So it's good practice mixed with the right mix of tools to get your organization to the point where you can have no incidences, or it might just be we have to backport a fix or something like that because we found one vulnerability that matters. So that's the real value in security. For the employee termination part, might have to do with recent COVID. A lot of people working from home, a lot of people on laptops traveling around the world and leaving things exposed. I'm kind of curious about that one.
So am I, and I have friends that work in security teams, and employee termination, it happens. Like, people get disgruntled, things go wrong, and then there's the accidental stuff as well. And certainly, I've worked a lot in the financial services industry. Like publishing code to GitHub was a fireable offense, kind of thing. So things, it is still a little high though, 11%. Wow. I guess I'm a little surprised by that. But I just wanted to second the thankless job that security can be. If you're in that 34% at the bottom, they're either security's not telling you, which I always suspect, because I think that way. But hopefully it means that nothing really happens. So this is specifically, I read this question as there was a problem with the pipeline itself, meaning the misconfiguration, secrets are exposed, not necessarily. And you expect vulnerabilities to come and go through your pipeline. You hopefully detect them at some point. But so I read this as this is something actually wrong with the pipeline itself, but I'm not sure that everyone else did. So if I wasn't going to read it that way, then I would have expected like let's say vulnerability got through when it shouldn't have, that kind of thing. Is that considered a pipeline problem? Right? Because if you did a postmortem on that, you'd say, hey, we didn't detect this when we should have. So if that gets included in this, then I understand the 23% slow delayed app development deployment kind of stuff. So employee termination is what's sticking in my mind. Like, wow, this is serious.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to have that scanning early on as part of the release and put it into sprints. So it's like, hey, okay, here's the one vulnerability security really wants you to patch. Security teams also know that there's a little bit of politics there. You can't patch everything. So it's focusing on the things that matter. There's a question here about should network policies or segmentation be part of CI/CD security? As part of StackRox, yes, 100%. A big fan. In fact, we have tools to basically auto-generate network policies based off of what the developer creates. So based off YAML manifests for Kubernetes, we can automatically create them and then check the baseline and do testing. So I think the earlier on that happens, the better it is for the security teams. When they get into the cluster, they can see that everything is green or that all the network flows are set up and structured properly.
There was one question about why fines due to CI/CD, and I can only speak for financial services, but if you work for a trading floor, for instance, and you don't close your book by the end of the day, the SEC will fine you. So that could be a database is down or a data center is down, or if something slowed you down that you had to build through a pipeline like this, you could absolutely get fined for not closing your books by the end of the day. So as one example.
Yep. In higher regulated industries, definitely more often. So, or maybe it's the put $5 if you in the kitty if you introduced a vulnerability. I don't know. No, I think we're talking more than the real fines. And shout out to Colin again.
Thank you, Colin.
Fantastic job over there in Q&A. So if you haven't checked that out, please do. Let's go to our last question that we asked, and then I want to end things talking a little bit about applying not just segmentation, which is super important. We talked about, but so be thinking about this. There's a lot of great work being done on isolating elements or steps within the CI/CD pipeline, kind of applying network segmentation or isolation into our pipeline process. So something is compromised, right? It doesn't move laterally through the whole process, et cetera. So keep that in the hopper. So who defines and updates the build pipelines for your code repository? So who is doing all this great work, or maybe needs to do more great work to do that? 41% said DevOps teams create and build pipelines in the release, automating continuous deployment. 23% said developers are doing this. 18% between two other options. Developers modify the pipelines for repository, but DevOps maintains the build systems. And lastly, we do not have consistent build pipeline responsibilities. That would have been a bigger number about 5 years ago, 3 years ago, than it is today. So DevOps is the most frequent for kind of owning it all, and then there's a mix, followed by developers, and then the kind of the hybrid model, I guess I would say.
I was going to chime in that the 23% of developers that create and maintain their own, those are tired developers.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot. That's if you're in a regulated industry, I don't think you could do it. I don't think you could stay up to speed with everything and make sure that everything's at the whatever security level you're looking at. It's too much. So I'm guessing that reflects developers at startups or where the security requirements are not as high. So that's what I would think about that, because otherwise you need DevOps to kind of take care of these things for you. That's anyway, that caught my eye.
Yeah, Jason hit the nail on the head. He said, I think that the question largely depends on the size, maturity of the org and scope of the project. When you see 41% where DevOps creates and maintains the build process, especially at anything that is a developer team greater than 6, 8, 10, you got to think the DevOps team is part of that application team, right? Because they have to be intimate. If developers need certain tests or they need changes, there has to be stand-ups and meetings in order to plan these things. So I'm assuming a large organization doesn't have a platform/DevOps team that just forces things down and says, developers, these are the tests that we're running with for your application. Assume that DevOps is part of that team. For developers who create and maintain, but then hand off to a DevOps team, I could see something like a data science team or a new field that maybe the DevOps team doesn't necessarily have as part of that org. So maybe it's a team of 3 or 4 that's saying, hey, we're getting this greenfield project off the ground. Here, can you run this in the platform? And that team doesn't really necessarily understand the platform that much. And the DevOps team doesn't understand the tool that they're building that much. But you eventually expect, as that application grows in size, that the DevOps team gets closer to them, right? So I think Jason saying it largely depends on the scope and maturity, I completely agree. The developers and the DevOps teams, I'm sure, will figure that out through a couple of meetings after a while with upper management.
And those, you've seen this, Mike, I'm sure, when we talk to people about using, the more mature the organization is, the more likely it is that DevOps team might be centralized and not as embedded. There may have been reasons that they pulled them back, and then that slows everything down, right? So you're trying to deliver something quickly. So this comes up all the time. Oh, it's just, so how do you introduce something that's actually going to keep the speed of something smaller, but have all of the right controls in place along the way? That is an ongoing challenge, I would say, for large, mature organizations.
Yeah, coming back from KubeCon, because Techstrong was there, I saw a huge movement towards a DevOps engineer being part of the development team for an app. So you had somebody who was app/runtime/DevOps specific focused, and then you had the platform SREs. So somebody that was focused on the build pipeline, developers that were focused on the functionality, and then they're handing it off to the platform SREs who knew how to optimize it, and then funneling all that feedback back to the developers.
And sometimes the platform engineers created the environments, right, that then kind of flowed into the DevOps and development process too.
Yeah, and I
think
think
it depends on kind of how you apply platform engineering.
Exactly, and I think this is obviously KubeCon, so it's based more around Kubernetes and containers, and I think that's just the natural evolution of containers now, where since they are becoming more modular, you do need all these different build processes, but then you do need a team to be able to bring them all together, because you can't expect developers to know the ins and outs of Kubernetes. It's pretty complex.
Great. Great. Well, the prize for didn't expect this question in the Q&A. Sukan is asking about eBPF and how that plays in this. So go check out Q&A. There's no prize for winning that, but you do get some notoriety during the during the webinar, during our conversation here. So if I'm curious your thoughts, if you were earlier in your evolution of setting up a development team, all the tech pipeline, the technologies, the tool chains, etc. Do you start right away with DevOps is in the team and just assume that that's going to be part of your flow going forward? Or do you think there's a natural evolution point where to be able to cross multiply across multiple development teams, now you've got to kind of pull it out and make it its own thing? What are your thoughts?
I can say for the more regulated industries I've worked in, it was not in the team from the get-go. There was a clear DevOps team. You would talk to them for sure, but they're not going to be embedded in your team because the requirements and the consequences of something happening are too high. But now it's the opposite. Now that DevOps person is one of the developers, we're spinning something up, we're iterating really quickly. Like you try and get a prototype out the door. You want to be secure, but you don't need to take it to like the app SRE process yet. But as soon as you get like one beta customer, you're there. You got to go talk to those guys and do it properly. But I've certainly worked in for banks and trading floors where no, you had to do that from the get-go. They just couldn't, because of the fines, because of the things we talked about earlier. Like it's just, it costs you too much if you make a mistake. So.
Yeah, and that structure also opens up market opportunities from a business standpoint, right? Once you have those security controls in place, when you can pass audits, when you can do things, especially in global markets, that opens up a significant path to revenue for a lot of technology companies. So I know we were talking about risk in the chat and weighing off, real world applications and all that stuff. Security, when implemented properly, does open up market opportunities, especially in some of, let's say, the consolidated security market that we're seeing around the world.
Mm-hmm. Something we haven't talked about is another factor is certain industries and organizations in those industries tend to move at a different pace, right? I'm not denigrating anybody by saying this, but insurance might move more slowly than, say, the latest AI tech company, right? Of adopting and changing and restructuring. And so that makes a big difference, the kind of company you're in, or what you were pointing out, Michelle, about the financial industry and regulatory reporting requirements that goes with that. And being able to leverage sort of the data exhaust that comes out of our tool chains to be able to support compliance requirements and all of that. So a lot of it depends on what industry you're in and the size and maturity of that organization. Maybe that's obvious to everybody, but I think it's worth pointing out. Well, great. So I had posed the question earlier to wrap up on. Some really interesting things that I came across and kind of getting ready to do this research, and a lot of good work going into thinking about applying, so I think of network security concepts such as isolation and segmentation to our CI/CD pipeline process as well, using containers. Now doesn't give you all security, but containers and access controls and putting minimal of only what you need into those environments, the build environments, the build tools, the tools along the tool chain or the workflow process. Thoughts about that? What kinds of things might people start doing if they haven't really looked at that seriously yet?
Go ahead,
There's a
Michelle.
lot. I was just gonna if you're really starting from the ground
That's a
up,
loaded question.
Wow, it is a loaded question. It's like, oh my goodness, you pull aside your platform engineers and stick them in a room with your DevOps people for a couple of weeks and see what comes out. But so I'm not so sure I know enough to answer that question in detail. I can tell you what I've seen. So the kind of enterprise customer we're seeing, it absolutely has secure and isolated areas. They're well versed in the basics in that way. It's sort of like what comes next, right? Like, oh, what do you mean we can't have 57 different repositories for our images? What do you mean we don't scan them regularly, or think it tends to be in the layers above that, and the And there's no centralized view of things like that. Like that is pulling it all together to say, yeah, I meet salsa level blah is actually a challenge for them at this time because they're not thinking that way. So you may have a better answer, but I don't know. I don't think I can answer the question like, okay, here are the 1,000,001 things you need to think of starting at the network level going up, just because the customers I've been dealing with are already there in some capacity. So, yeah.
Yeah, it really depends on maturity level, to be honest. If you're starting from square one and you're building open source, it's secure base images, secure packages, make sure that they're highly trusted packages. A lot of large organizations are working and using them. It's a great place to start because you are pulling from the wealth of experience of all of the large enterprise organizations that are funneling code PRs back into the open source community. So I would always start from there. And then setting up a stable pipeline, making sure it's secure, making sure you have a principle of least privilege of access in that pipeline. Start with that and then get your application running on a secure, isolated environment. Once you have a greenfield deployment, you can then start to look for DevOps and the platform that works best for it. There was a comment in the chat about how, oh, we have 9 customers. We need to deploy to Kubernetes. You're not really going to know until you get that application built. Would not recommend deploying to Kubernetes by yourself with 9 customers. But yeah, again, it's just a maturity level. There's tons of guides out there on the Red Hat website to help you too get started. And of course, open source community is here as a resource. So what we do at Red Hat is we have open source Slack channels and things like that where you can ping engineers directly, which sometimes they're happy about, but
they're always happy about it.
Yeah. So one of the resources I wanted to kind of join in the mix here is from the defense organizations have provided. I would consider it fairly basic, but I think a nice structure to look at if you're looking for a way of kind of how to get my mind straight about how to do this. I'm going to add this link into the chat there for folks to check out. If you're needing something to kind of back up what you're doing is a good starting point, not a bad thing to look at. So that's I think we're going to run out of time here. I need to give Cody time things to wrap up, but I do want to thank both of you for this and point folks to downloading the PulseMeter report. There's a lot more other content and things that we've written about that from an analyst perspective as Techstrong research with this data. And of course, there's many more resources, other kinds of reports, as well as PulseMeters that are on the Techstrong research site at /resources. And last but not least, there is a really great, very cool, I just came across this recently, site Red Hat has around Red Hat Trusted Software Supply Chain. A lot of great resources there, some videos and charts and documents you can download, some guides, a lot of great things. So please check that out. And of course, I want to thank both you, Michelle and Mike, for being such an integral part of this process and collaborators on this work and being on this webinar together. And of course, thank Red Hat organization, Colin and the full crew for doing this work together with us. So with that, I'll turn it back to Cody.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And just to reiterate, the link that is posted on the screen is pinned in that blue bubble at the top of the chat. So feel free to click that and pull that up to check out later. So Michelle, Mike, and Mitch, thank you all so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure to dive into these stats with you and to look at all of this and to hear all this feedback from our wonderful audience who gave us so much more to work with today. So thank you guys for really incorporating our audience into this today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So a couple final words, just a reminder to our audience, we have been recording our session today. You will be receiving this recording shortly after we conclude today, as soon as possible. You can also find it living on the DevOps website. That's devops.com/webinars, and it will be in the on-demand section. I'd like to once again thank Red Hat for sponsoring our program. I'd like to thank our speakers, and to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. At the bottom of the chat, I posted a link to our survey. If you would just take 30 seconds to fill that out for us. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's program, or of course, if you have suggestions for future topics, please let us know there. Either way, we hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you everyone for being part of the process here.